Today, we're going to jump back in time to solve a mystery from 1971. And you might be asking, why? Well, because understanding how a war was reported over 50 years ago gives us this incredibly powerful lens to see how news is being shaped for us right now. So let's do it. Let's step back and see how a hidden story was told. Our story really starts with a puzzle. It's about a single historical event that was basically told in two completely different ways. There's the story of what was actually happening on the ground, and then there's the story that people were reading on the front pages of the world's biggest newspapers. Just imagine this for a second. It's 1971. The Pakistani military unleashes this brutal crackdown in what was then East Pakistan. The result is a total humanitarian catastrophe. We're talking millions of people forced to flee their homes, creating one of the worst refugee crises of the entire 20th century. It was later recognized as a genocide. So with all that going on, what would you expect the lead story to be? The human tragedy, right? Yeah, well, it wasn't. The horrific human cost was not the main story that readers were seeing on page one. And to understand why that is, we need to look at the invisible architecture of the news itself. This brings us to a really crucial idea that helps explain this whole disconnect. It's a tool that shapes how we see an event, and a lot of the time we don't even realize it's happening. It's a concept called framing. So, what is framing? Honestly, the easiest way to think about it is like a picture frame. The frame decides what you see inside the picture, and just as importantly, what gets left out. In the news, journalists select certain facts, certain words, certain images to tell a story. And that selection process creates a frame that encourages us to see the story in one particular way. It's not about lying, it's all about emphasis. And check this out. This slide shows framing in action perfectly. You've got two incredibly similar, tragic events. In 1983, the Soviet Union shoots down a Korean passenger plane. The US media frames it as a moral outrage, using words like massacre and crime. Okay, now fast forward 5 years. The US Navy shoots down an Iranian passenger plane. This time, the very same media outlets frame it as a technical problem, a tragic mistake. See? Same type of event, two completely different frames. Okay, so let's take this idea of framing and apply it to our 1971 mystery. We're going to be like forensic investigators here. And our main piece of evidence comes from a 2015 academic paper that did all the heavy lifting for us, analyzing hundreds of original news articles from that time. So these researchers looked at every single front-page story about the Bangladesh Liberation War published in two of the most influential newspapers in the entire world, the New York Times and the Times of London. And they looked at the whole war, from the very first day of the military crackdown all the way to the final surrender. All right, time for the big reveal. What did those front pages actually focus on? What frames did these huge newspapers use to tell the story of this war? The results are pretty startling. The number one frame in over a third of all front-page stories was military conflict. We're talking stories about troops, battles, tactics, and equipment. Coming in at a close second was the prognostic frame. You can just think of this as the what happens next frame. It's all about the geopolitical consequences and the involvement of the big superpowers, the US, the Soviet Union, and China. And here's the crucial part, the human interest frame. You know, the one that covers the suffering of civilians and refugees. That was a distant third. And stories about the actual violence of the war, that was fourth. The genocide and the humanitarian crisis were literally not the lead story. The study also looked at the tone. And again, it's a surprise. You'd think a story about a war for independence would be super positive or super negative, right? But no, half of all the front page coverage was explicitly neutral. It was presented like a balanced, two sides to every story conflict, not a struggle against a genocidal regime. But why? Well, the answer is in the sources. I want you to just look at this number. Because behind all those frames and all those tones, there's this one statistic that basically unlocks the entire mystery. 75.8%. What does that mean? It means that for over 3/4 of all front-page stories about this war, the main source of information wasn't refugees or aid workers or freedom fighters. Nope. They were talking to officials in Washington and London. Okay, so if reporters were just quoting government officials, the next logical question is, what story did those governments want to tell? What was the official script? This quote from Henry Kissinger, who was the U.S. National Security Advisor at the time, really says it all.
For the Nixon administration, this wasn't about human rights in Bangladesh. It was about geopolitics. Pakistan was a critical ally. It was a secret back channel for the US to open up relations with China and a key partner against the Soviet Union.
And this just lays out the Cold War chessboard perfectly. You have to remember, the US and UK governments weren't seeing a war for independence. They were seeing a proxy battle. Pakistan was their piece on the board. The independence movement, which was supported by their rivals India and the Soviet Union, was the opposing side. So of course, the official story they told reporters was all about military strategy and superpower maneuvering, which are the exact frames that we saw dominate the news coverage.
Okay, let's connect all the dots. The evidence is all here, and the pattern is crystal clear. We can now see the entire chain of influence that shaped how millions of people understood this war.
It basically works like this. The US and UK governments define the war based on their own strategic interests. The media, relying almost completely on those same governments for information, adopted that definition. As the study itself put it, the newspapers basically echoed the voices of their respective governments. And the result? The story on the front page became one of geopolitical chess. And the story of genocide and unimaginable human suffering, that got pushed to the inside pages or left out of the frame entirely.
This whole case from 1971 isn't just history, it's a lesson for right now. The frames are still there, that reliance on official sources is still there, and the geopolitical interests of powerful nations still shape the story we're told. So the next time you read a headline or see a report about a conflict somewhere else in the world, remember this story and ask yourself, what's the frame here? Whose story is being centered? And maybe most importantly of all, what's being left out?